Forward to sharing a few thoughts with you about the single consecrated life. Some of you may know about it. It may be a new thing to many of you. I've been the Episcopal advisor to what's called the network of Single Consecrated Life since about 2013. Looking back on I've just celebrated 20 years as a bishop, and I was thinking about what the bishop did with Julian when he had to perform the sealing up of her anchorite cell. I've never had to do that bizarre thing, but I have done lots of bizarre things as a bishop, like more recently I had to go, and I was asked to go and bless a blast furnace at a local glass works. I couldn't find any prayer for blessing a blast furnace. Got no idea what to. The only good thing was that when we got there, it was so noisy, nobody could hear what I said anyway. So I just blessed it. And the sad thing was that they were making blue bottles for Bombay Sapphire at the time, but there was no gin around, so I didn't get a drop at all. So right at the heart of all that we do is the fact that God has created us all with a purpose, with a mission. And only each individual can fulfill that mission in their own unique way. It is for everyone a mission of love and a love relationship. And fulfilling God's plan for your life should take your whole heart. The vocation to the single consecrated life liberates the heart in a unique way so as to make it burn with greater love for God and all humanity. For with one's heart freed in love, the person committed to single consecrated life bears witness that the kingdom of God and his justice is indeed a pearl of great price, which is preferred to every value, no matter how great. And when it's lived in a spirit of faith and gift, the single consecrated life can be one of many roads by which the grace of baptism is realized, and a person may advance towards the holiness to which we are all called. And of course, while many people who are single have to live a life of chastity, the person called to consecrated single life dedicates themselves permanently and privately to live celibately for the sake of the kingdom. People exploring this call can be single, and in some cases widowed or divorced. Mature Christians, men and women already committed to a life of prayer and willing to undertake a period of discernment before taking a temporary vow which may precede a life vow. An appropriate spiritual director and support from a religious community or through the members of the Single Consecrated Life Network is an important part of that formation. Each person who takes a vow is asked to have a rule of life. And as you know, I don't need to tell you, a rule of life is a way of keeping us focused on God, rather than a set of rules to be obeyed in detail. A rule sets out details of our daily life, including times of prayer and other community activities. A rule helps transmit the wisdom of the past through to the current generation. Of course, the rule of St. Benedict is probably the most famous. He says, "We intend to establish a school of the Lord's service In drawing up its regulations, we hope to lay down nothing that is harsh or burdensome. The good of all concerned, however, may prompt us to a little strictness in order to amend our faults and to safeguard love. So people are encouraged to have a rule of life which should be simple and doable, not made so hard as to be impossible. Can include some elements such as times of prayer and reading the Bible. It can also cover many aspects of life like fasting, going to church, reading, caring for the environment, how to use your money, how to use your spare time, going on retreat and taking a rest. The single consecrated life is a covenant commitment whereby a person professes a vow of consecrated celibacy as a way of making a personal response to God's call. Now, some members of the network exercise an apostolic ministry, sharing their faith, doing good works, and others take a more contemplative lifestyle. The vow has to be received by a bishop following the period of testing and preparation. In most cases, candidates take this temporary vow for a period of years before finally making a life vow. The bishop can appoint someone to be the guardian of the vow, who will normally meet with the person once a year to review how things are going. The vows of poverty and obedience, which are normally made by those living within a religious community, should not be made. But the spirit of evangelical counsels may be expressed by promises of direction of life, of stewardship, or simplicity. A commitment to a particular lifestyle, devotion, or ministry may also be made at the time of consecration. But the vowed person should bear in mind that personal circumstances might or will change. Sometimes a ring or a cross or an office book or a candle or an icon may be given during the rite of consecration as an outward sign or symbol of the vow and the life being undertaken. At the rite of consecration, the person stands before the bishop, who says, the person says, "Father, receive my resolution to follow Christ in a life of consecrated celibacy, which here I profess for X years or for life before you and God's people, and pray that I may be given grace to persevere in love and faithfulness." The bishop then says the prayer of consecration. Loving Father, you have loved and redeemed us through your Son, Jesus Christ. He is your word, through whom you made all things were made. Look with favor on this your servant, who has resolved to follow you in the holy state of celibacy. You have inspired him or her to make this vow, and he now gives you his or her heart. Lord, protect them as she desires to be strengthened by your blessing and consecration. The single consecrated life was given formal recognition by the Church of England in 2005. The network was launched after research by the then Bishop of Monmouth, Dominic Walker, and Sister Christine of the community of St. John the Divine in Birmingham, because there was an increasing number of requests from people and from bishops for advice and guidance about those who wanted to be admitted to consecrated celibate life. The network began in a small way. A subgroup of the Advisory Council for Relations between bishops and religious communities was formed. Guidelines were drawn up. A rite was approved for consecration services, and an Episcopal advisor was appointed. I'd say today, each year, there are a number, perhaps up to 10 vows being made. We have a group of 5 mature members of the network who are called deans, who help to run the network. And there are approximately 100 consecrated life members in the network, as well as many friends and a growing number of contacts with other Anglican churches throughout the world. One of the SCL members says this: "What is really important for me is that it is a step that you can take and still live an ordinary life. For many years, I have felt a call related to earlier people who have lived vowed lives, like Julian of Norwich, but I did not really understand what it was all about. The SCL vow sets me free to have relationships with all kinds of people and not be worried about it. My own sense of identity and of my own inner power. No matter what situation I am in, it makes me less vulnerable. I know where I'm coming from, and that is it. It is a boundary that will not be crossed. It's so much more comfortable now to have friendships and relationships." And another member of the network says this: "The blessing of SCL is that it enables a different pathway of the religious life, but one that goes back to biblical times. It is very ancient and at the same time very new." So the resurgence of this vocation means going right back to the church's roots. The monastic life has been a part of the Christian experience, as we know, from early centuries, with men and women choosing to live together, usually in single-sex houses. Increasingly, however, there developed the impulse among men and women from about the time of the Charlemagne's reforms, which saw the acceptance of Christianity throughout the empire, to seek the white martyrdom of the desert experience. Both men and women sought the solitude and the danger of the desert in order to devote their lives to prayer, fasting, and penance, both for themselves and on behalf of their world. And indeed, the word monasticism derives from the Greek root monos, meaning alone. It was not long, however, before these desert hermits began to attract others to their way of life, and gradually organized communities of hermits evolved, gathered in close proximity to their abbot or abbess, living in separate huts or caves and coming together for weekly worship and occasional shared meals. It is not possible to give reliable dates when this flight to the desert began, but we know that the earliest record of the life of St. Anthony, attributed to St. Athanasius, suggests that he began his life in the desert around the year 270. He was not the innovator of the life, and is likely to have been following the example of others who had gone before him. Gradually, as men and women increasingly gathered together, such hermetic communities began to formulate rules for living, and as the ascetical life lived in solitude was not for everyone, it became easier and safer, both physically and mentally, for those called to the ascetical life to live in a way of living under the framework of a rule. So what about its development in England? Well, nevertheless, the call to the solitary and hermetical way continued, and English spirituality in particular has been enriched and enhanced by those who chose to live such a way of life. It is to the anchor hold and hermitage that we are indebted for those great classics of English spirituality, the writings of Richard Rolle, Walter Hilton's Ladder of Perfection, the anonymous Cloud of Unknowing, and of course, the revelation of divine love of Mother Julian of Norwich. There were at that time, however, in the 13th century time, in addition, a number of anonymous solitaries, either living on the edge of villages or engaged in manual work or enclosed beside the parish church, who lived a life of contemplation and prayer, and who could not fail but influence the piety of their neighbours. In addition, anchorites and anchoresses were frequently consulted in spiritual matters. You probably heard that Margaret Kemp consulted Julian in her anchor hold in Norwich. Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich probably were both illiterate, but these two medieval Christian mystics are a strikingly early example of literary female friendship. For with the help of scribes, both women wrote books which play crucial parts in literary history. Julian's work is the earliest surviving book by a woman written in English. And Marjorie Kemp's manuscript, known simply today as the Book of Marjorie Kemp, is considered the first English autobiography. We have to jump then to the 19th century. Marian Rebecca Hughes was the first person to make a religious profession in the Church of England after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. Her action was a small seed that developed into the religious life as we now know it in the Anglican Communion. It is hard today not to realize how revolutionary the act was and radical for the Victorian Church. There were no convents. There were no religious rules. There was little acceptance of the idea of religious sisterhoods, and it was unclear to her how she should take the step in the religious life in this very early period. Even the more Tractarian-minded had little real contact with brothers and sisters in either the Roman Catholic Church or any of the Orthodox churches, and no experience of religious life. Marian was the daughter of a vicar, the Vicar of Shennington. Her brother was also ordained and took up the position of her father in that parish after his death. She had been reading the works of John Henry Newman and following the development of the tracts of the Oxford movement. She had also heard of the Sisters of Charity and the desire of them to have a Protestant version of sisters who might nurse the sick and look after the poor. She was in contact with one of the teachers of Hebrew at Oxford University, Dr. Seeger, who was also a colleague of Dr. Pusey. It is clear from her diary that she felt called to a consecrated life and to remain unmarried. This came to a head on Trinity Sunday, 1841, when she became the first professed religious in the Church of England. And it is said that by the time she died in 1912, there were twice as many religious women in the Church of England than when Henry dissolved the monasteries. She wore no distinct dress, and she went about for many years visiting religious communities in France before she took this vow of consecration as a virgin. She went on later, of course, to found a religious community, the community of the Holy Trinity, and then became, of course, the abbess. For many centuries, the monastery and the hermitage have witnessed to God's loving presence in a world frequently caught up in the business and distractions of life. And they have continued to witness to a life lived counterculturally. The vocation of the single consecrated life, alongside that of a life lived in the community of a monastery or a convent, witnesses to the gentle call of God's still small voice as men and women seek to live the religious life of the anchorite for today's world. There are many ways of living the single consecrated life, as there are of those who live it, and its variety and liveliness evidence a dynamic life inspired by the Holy Spirit and exemplified by the unity and diversity which is God. One member of the network says this: "My own dedication to this way of life, I believe, is part of that diversity of God, as I seek to live under the vows of simplicity of living, celibacy, obedience, and solitude, which brings me back to the distinction I make between the hermit and the solitary. The vocation of the hermit is, as I understand it, qualitatively different to that of the solitary, although there are clearly many similarities, indeed overlaps in living the religious life in these ways. However, the vocation of the hermit, as I see it, is a more enclosed, hidden way of life and contemplation than that of the solitary life, as I am interpreting it. To live the life of a solitary is to make a conscious decision for aloneness with God. And my additional vow of solitude seeks to make concrete my desire for God, which becomes the foundation of my active ministry as the contemplative and the active influence and feed each other." So living the single consecrated life today. In today's society, celibacy is often seen as irrelevant, unnatural, a pointless sacrifice. So celibacy is countercultural. To be celibate, for some, it seems to be weird or even inadequate in some way. And the church has found it hard to value both marriage and singleness, to view marriage and singleness as two different paths, both from God and both given by God as a particular gift at a particular phase of ministry. It is only by doing this, however, that all phases of life will be seen as a part of the blessing of the Creator God. Singleness can be a temporary phase for some, and for others, a lifelong vocation. Given the numbers of people who are inquiring all the time, I think it shows that the Single Consecrated Life network has met the needs of many, many individuals. And although it's difficult for us to promote this, we have a website and we have had articles in the Church Times and others. I suspect that many, many people have not really come across it or have engaged with it. So I hope that through sharing this with you, you might be interested, or you might be able to tell others about it. Father Bruce.
Tony, thank you. That was just excellent, and I know that is going to be of great interest to many people assembled here. When I first invited Bishop Tony, he phoned me up and said, "I'm not sure whether I should do this. I'm not sure if I have anything I can say." And I knew you would have, and indeed you certainly have proved me right. Thank you very much indeed. What our practice has been, Bishop Tony, is just to have a couple of minutes silence now, just to allow what you said just to settle in us before we then move into some breakout groups. So
I've got some questions I'll put in the chat. Is that all right?
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. So let's just keep a couple of minutes silence together.